The boy's hands were shaking when he broke the biscuit. Not from cold, it was 100 degrees in the Texas shade. He was shaking because there wasn't enough. 5 children. 1 biscuit gone stale 2 days ago. Ethan Calloway watched from across the street as the 13-year-old split that pitiful thing into 5 pieces, gave the biggest to his baby sister, and put the smallest fragment barely a mouthful in his own mouth, and chewed slowly, so it would last. Ethan's hand tightened on his saddlebag and didn't let go. If that hit you somewhere deep, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to the end, because what happens next will stay with you a long time. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1878 was the kind that broke things. It broke the creek beds first, then the topsoil, then the cattle, then the men who owned them. By the time Ethan Calloway rode into Dust Haven, Texas on a Wednesday in late July, the town had already been broken for a while. He could tell by the way nobody moved fast. People in healthy towns moved with purpose. People in dying towns moved like they were saving their energy for something, though they couldn't have said what. Ethan tied Scout to the post outside the general store and stood a moment scanning the street. Old habit. 11 years as a range detective had built a kind of permanent watchfulness into him that didn't care whether he was still working or not. He wasn't. Hadn't been for 14 months. But his eyes moved the same way regardless. The street was mostly empty. A man repairing a wagon wheel. A woman shaking a rug from an upstairs window. A dog sleeping in the only patch of shade wide enough to matter. At the far end of the main street, one building stood out 2 stories. Fresh white paint, gold lettering across the window. Crane Land and Financial, and on the boardwalk in front of it, a man in a gray suit stood talking to 2 other men. Even from this distance, something about his posture made Ethan look twice. The man wasn't just standing on that boardwalk, he was presiding over it. Ethan filed that away and pushed through the general store door. He bought jerky hardtack, a tin of coffee, and a loaf of bread. He was thinking about nothing in particular except the road west when he stepped back outside and saw them. 5 children. Tucked into the strip of shade along the side of the livery stable, pressed together in the dirt. 2 boys, 3 girls. The oldest, maybe 13. The youngest, no more than 4. Their clothes had been washed so many times the color had given up entirely. Their boots were cracked along the seams. The oldest boy had something on his knee, a folded cloth, and he was opening it with the kind of care a man takes with something he cannot afford to drop. Inside the cloth was a biscuit, not a full biscuit. A partial one, the leftover end of something that had been mostly eaten by someone else somewhere else, probably yesterday. The boy leaned dark-haired with a jaw already set in a way that didn't belong on a 13-year-old face, looked at it for a moment. Then he pressed both thumbs into it and broke it into 5 pieces. Ethan stopped walking. The boy didn't rush. He worked at it deliberately, calculating the way a man stretches a last dollar across more days than it was meant to cover. The smallest girl, blonde curls, cheeks flushed deep pink from the heat, couldn't have been more than 4, lunged for the biggest piece immediately. The boy moved it. Be firm, quiet. Clara first. But Danny? Clara first, then Ada, then Tommy, then you. I'm hungry right now, B said with the iron conviction of a 4-year-old who has made a decision. I know, Danny said. We all are. A girl of about 11 took her piece, dark-haired, quick-eyed, and held it in her palm without eating it, waiting. A quieter girl, 7 or so, with a face so still it made you feel she was reading something the rest of them couldn't see, accepted hers, and held it the same way. The second boy, 9 years old and gap-toothed, took his piece and immediately looked at Danny. You gonna eat yours this time? Tommy asked. In a minute. You said that yesterday, and then you gave it to B. Tommy. I'm just saying you did. I know what I did. Only after B had her piece clutched in both fists and had taken her first small bite, closing her eyes briefly, the way people do when something tastes better than they expected, even when it doesn't taste like much. Only then did Danny pick up what remained. The smallest fragment. The broken tail end of a biscuit that hadn't been enough to begin with. He put it in his mouth and chewed slowly. Ethan had been standing still for over a minute. He realized it, and didn't move anyway. He turned and went back into the general store. He put both hands on the counter and looked at the wood grain for a moment. "Back already," the shopkeeper said. "Need another loaf," Ethan said. "Whatever's freshest." He paid without discussing it, tucked the bread under his arm, and walked back out. The heat came down on him like a hand pressing from above. He crossed the street. Danny saw him coming when he was still 20 feet away. The boy rose to his feet without hurrying. He didn't step forward. He just stood up and positioned himself slightly in front of the others, weight distributed, chin-level, eyes steady. A 13-year-old who had already worked out that the first job was to be between. Ethan crouched down when he got close, brought himself to eye level, set the loaf of bread on the ground between them, and didn't say anything elaborate about it. "Bought too much," he said. Nobody moved. B peered around Danny's hip at the bread with enormous eyes. "You don't know us," Danny said. "No." "So why?" Ethan looked at him. "Because you looked like you could use it more than I could." Clara had gotten to her feet. She was studying Ethan with the focused attention of someone running calculations. "Is it because you feel sorry for us?" she asked. "Clara," Danny said. "I want to know." Ethan met her eyes. Sharp girl. Sharper than she probably got credit for. "No, miss," he said. "It's not sorry. Sorry doesn't do much for anybody." Something in her expression shifted just slightly. Tommy scrambled up and leaned around Danny's other side. "Danny," he said in what he clearly believed was a whisper. "That is a whole bread." "I can see that." "A whole one." "Tommy, I have eyes." "I'm just making sure you're seeing what I'm seeing." Danny's jaw moved. A suppressed something, not quite a smile, but in the neighborhood. He crouched and picked up the bread, turned it over in his hands, checking it the way a careful person checks a gift before trusting it. Then, without a second's hesitation, he broke it and handed the larger half to Clara. "Split it between them," he said. "Danny, you need to, Clara. You need to eat." "I will eat." "You always." "Clara." He said it the way a much older person says a name. The way a person says it when they are asking to be trusted and don't have the energy to explain why. Clara pressed her mouth shut, took the bread, started breaking pieces off for Ada and B. Tommy had already attacked the other half with the unself-conscious dedication of a 9-year-old at peace with his hunger. B received her piece and bit into it with both hands, and both eyes closed again. Ethan watched Danny eat last, watched him take a small measured bite, chew it slowly, watch his siblings while he did. "What are your names?" Ethan asked. "Danny Holt." The boy gestured without looking away from Ethan. "Clara, Tommy, Ada, the little one's B. Ethan Calloway." He tipped his hat. "Where are your folks?" The air changed. It was remarkable how completely and instantly a simple question could change the quality of air in a place. Clara's chewing slowed. Tommy looked at the ground. Ada, who hadn't spoken yet, lifted her eyes from her bread and fixed them on Ethan with a directness that was almost startling. Danny straightened. "Papa passed last spring." "I'm sorry." "Victor Crane's fence crew, North Ridge. Post anchor gave way." The boy said it without inflection. Not because he didn't feel it, Ethan could see he felt it, but because he had said it enough times that he'd worn the raw edge off. "They said it was an accident." Ethan caught the word. Said. "And your mother?" Silence. A different kind of silence than the one before. "She's sick," Clara said. "She'll be fine," Danny said immediately. Clara looked at her brother. Didn't argue. That restraint, a girl of 11 choosing not to contradict, told Ethan more than argument would have. "Where is she?" he asked. Danny pointed down the street to a narrow building set apart from the main row. It had the look of something that used to be a laundry or a storage room, and had been pressed into other service since. The shutters hung at angles. A thin thread of smoke climbed from the stovepipe and dissolved immediately in the summer heat. "She's resting," Danny said. "We came out to find food. We don't like leaving her long." "How long has she been sick?" Tommy answered before he could stop himself. "Since May." Danny closed his eyes briefly. 2 months, Ethan said. "She's getting better," Danny said. "She had a bad night," Ada said. Her voice was quiet and level and completely without drama. "She didn't know where she was when we woke up this morning. She called Tommy by our father's name. Nobody said anything, said. I'd like to look in on her," Ethan said, "if that's all right." Danny's eyes narrowed. "Why?" "Because a woman sick that long in this heat with 5 children trying to manage by themselves is something that needs more than one pair of hands. We're managing." "I know you are." Ethan looked at him steadily. "You're doing more than most grown men would. But managing and being all right aren't the same thing, and I think you know that." The boy held the stare for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not surrender, nothing as simple as that. More like the look of a person who has been holding a door shut against a very strong wind and is beginning to understand that their arms are giving out. "She's sleeping," Danny said finally. "Don't wake her." "I won't." They walked together, the 5 children moving around Ethan in a loose cluster. Bea reached up and took his hand. No preamble, no hesitation. Just a small, warm hand wrapping around 2 of his fingers, like it was the obvious thing to do. Ethan didn't remark on it. Inside the building held the dense, stale heat of a room that hadn't had a proper window opened in weeks. Ethan's eyes adjusted. A cot along the far wall. A woman on it. He crossed the room and stopped. Margaret Holt was younger than her situation had any right to allow. 30, maybe 32. Chestnut hair spread dark against the pillow, damp at the temples. Even in sleep, even with the fever flush high in her cheeks and the shadows cut deep beneath her eyes, there was something in the set of her jaw that hadn't let go. A quality that looked like stubbornness, but was probably something closer to refusal. The refusal to stop. Ethan had seen it before, in men pushed past their limit on trail drives, in women who had buried too much and kept standing anyway. It was a particular kind of strength that didn't look like strength from the outside. It just looked like someone who hadn't quit yet. On the shelf beside her cot, an empty tin cup. A medicine bottle with perhaps a teaspoon of dark liquid left in it. A cloth folded small laid across her wrist, where someone had tried to cool her pulse point. One of the children had thought of that. He didn't know which one. He crouched beside the cot and held his hand near her forehead without touching it. The heat radiating from her skin hit him before he was close. Serious fever. The kind that didn't announce it was leaving. "She was better 4 days ago," Clara said from behind him. Her voice had gone quieter. She sat up. She braided Ada's hair. "She sang," Bea added solemnly. "She sang the one about the river." Ethan stood. "Has Dr. Rourke been back?" Danny's face shifted. "We went to him 2 weeks ago, when the fever came back worse." "What did he say?" Clara answered. Her voice was flat, the way voices go flat when they are holding something very heavy, very carefully. "He said he couldn't extend credit to a family with no income and no property." She paused. "He also said we didn't hear it from him directly. He told Mrs. Garner. She told the dressmaker." "What did he say?" Ethan asked again. Ada looked up from the floor. "He said she was probably already past the point where medicine would help. She said it the way she said everything, quietly, precisely, without looking away. He said the children ought to start thinking about what comes next." The room was very still. Bea was sitting on the edge of the cot, her small hand resting on her mother's arm, patting it in a slow, gentle rhythm. She didn't seem to have heard Ada's words, or didn't understand them. She just kept patting, steady, patient, the way children love people, without conditions and without stopping. Ethan straightened. "Tell me about Crane." Danny went still. What do you know about Crane? Only what you've told me. You mentioned his name. Something about how your father died. Papa was working his fence line, Tommy said. Crane's fence line. The anchor in the rock gave, and the wire snapped back and... He stopped, looked at Danny. Danny gave him a short nod. Tommy looked back at Ethan. It was real fast, he said. That's what the other men said, that it was fast. He owned your father's work contract, Ethan said. He owns most of the contracts in this county, Danny said. He owns the land outside town. He owns the mill. He owns the note on every building on this street. The boy's voice had dropped the way voices drop when they're talking about something with real weight. 6 weeks after Papa died, he sent a man with papers. Said we were behind on the rent for our house. Said we had until the end of August. End of August. Ethan did the arithmetic. 3 weeks. Yes, sir. And your mother was already sick when the papers came. She was already sick when Papa died, Clara said quietly. She got worse after. Ethan looked at Maggie Holt's face, the jaw that still hadn't let go even now, even in fever. The hand that Bea was patting so carefully over and over. All right, he said. Danny looked at him. All right, what? I'm going to talk to Dr. Rourke. He won't come back. He made that plain. Then I'll make it plain in the other direction. Ethan picked up his hat. Lock the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone you don't know. We know what to do, Danny said with a flicker of something that might have been irritation or might have been pride. I know you do, Ethan said. I'm saying it anyway. He turned for the door. He was nearly through it when Ada's voice came from behind him. Mr. Calloway? He turned. She was still sitting on the floor, cross-legged, her bread finished. She was looking at him with that reading something invisible expression. Why are you helping us? She asked. Really? Ethan looked at her for a moment. 7 years old, and she'd already learned to ask the second question, the real one underneath the first one. Because somebody ought to, he said. Ada held his eyes for another second. Then she nodded once, as if that answer had passed some internal test he hadn't known he was taking. He stepped outside. The heat fell on him like a wall. Down the street outside the white building with the gold letters Victor Crane was still on his boardwalk. Still presiding. One of the men with him laughed at something Crane said, and Crane smiled the way men smile when they are entirely comfortable with their own power. Ethan put his hat on, turned away from Crane, walked toward the doctor's house. Behind him inside that dim and sweltering room, Bea was still patting her mother's hand, still singing something small and tuneless under her breath. The medicine bottle on the shelf held 1 teaspoon of dark liquid and nothing more. And in 3 weeks Victor Crane's man would come with papers. And Maggie Holt's jaw was still set even in sleep like a woman who had decided she was not finished yet. Like a woman who was waiting for a reason to fight her way back. Dr. Rourke's house sat at the end of a short side street, white-painted with a wooden sign hung by 1 nail. The nail had been loose long enough that the sign hung crooked and nobody had fixed it. Ethan knocked twice firm and waited. The man who opened the door was somewhere in his mid-50s with the particular look of someone who had once cared deeply about his work and had since made peace with caring less. He was in shirt sleeves, no jacket, a napkin still tucked at his collar. Ethan had interrupted his supper. Yes, Rourke said. My name's Calloway. I need to talk to you about Maggie Holt. Something moved across the doctor's face. Not guilt exactly, more like the expression of a man who had already decided something and didn't appreciate being asked to revisit it. I've already seen Mrs. Holt, he said. I told the children. I know what you told the children, Ethan said. I'd like you to tell me. Rourke studied him. You family? No. Then I don't see how this is your concern, Mr. Calloway. Ethan kept his voice level. And it's my concern because I've just come from a room where a woman is running a fever that's been climbing for 2 months, while 5 children take turns putting a damp cloth on her wrist and praying. The youngest one is 4 years old. She's been singing to her mother to keep her calm. He paused. So, I'm making it my concern. Rourke pulled the napkin from his collar slowly. Come in, he said. The doctor's sitting room was tidy in the way of a man who lived alone. Books on a shelf, a good lamp, a half-eaten meal on a side table. Rourke sat down heavily in his chair, but didn't offer Ethan a seat. Ethan didn't take one anyway. He stood. She has pneumonia, Rourke said. Or something close to it. In this heat with this dust, it moves differently than it does in winter, but it moves just as fast. He folded the napkin across his knee. I told the oldest boy in June that she needed medicine, rest, proper food, and to be kept cool. I also told him I couldn't continue extending credit to a family with no means to pay. So you walked away, Ethan said. I have a practice to maintain, supplies to purchase. I am not... Rourke stopped, looked at the window. I am not a charity. No, Ethan said. You're a doctor. The room was quiet for a moment. What does that woman need right now? Ethan asked. Specifically, tell me what she needs and what it costs, and we'll settle the question of who pays after. Rourke looked at him with something that might have been reassessment. Quinine compound, willow bark extract, a proper fever reducer, clean water given consistently, not just when the children remember to fetch it, broth, real broth, not water with salt in it. And she needs to be moved somewhere cooler than that building. It's holding heat like a furnace. What does the medicine cost? The compounds together $4. Ethan reached into his coat and laid $4 on the side table without discussion. Rourke looked at the money, then at Ethan. That doesn't obligate me to make house calls. No, Ethan agreed. But you're going to anyway. Am I? Yes. Ethan picked up his hat from where he'd set it. Because you became a doctor for a reason, and I don't think that reason was to eat supper in peace while a 32-year-old woman dies 2 streets over. He moved toward the door. I'll expect you in an hour. Bring whatever else she needs. I'll cover it. He didn't wait for an answer. He stepped back into the evening heat and heard behind him the sound of a chair being pushed back from a table. That was answer enough. Ethan was halfway back down the main street when he heard his name. Not his full name. Just Calloway. Said in a particular way, the way men say a name when they want you to know they already know it. He turned. The man in the gray suit had stepped down from the boardwalk in front of the Land and Financial Building and was walking toward him. Up close, Victor Crane was younger than Ethan had expected. 40, maybe 42. Well-fed without being soft. He had the kind of face that was handsome in a way that had learned to work for him, and eyes that did the calculating his expression never showed. Didn't catch you in town before, Crane said, stopping a comfortable distance away. Friendly distance. The distance of a man who was not worried. You passing through? Might be, Ethan said. Buy you a drink. I'm all right. Crane smiled. It was an easy smile. Well practiced. I make it a point to know the people who come through Dusthaven. Small town, you understand. Newcomers stand out. He glanced down the street toward the narrow building where the Holt children were. Especially ones who take an interest in certain families. Ethan looked at him. You watch your street pretty close. I watch my town, Crane said without any change in his smile. Your town, Ethan repeated. Figure of speech. Crane tilted his head slightly. The Holts are a sad situation, truly. I have a great deal of sympathy for those children, losing their father the way they did. He paused, and the pause was the most honest thing about him. But sympathy doesn't satisfy a debt, Mr. Calloway. The law is the law. It tends to be, Ethan said, when it belongs to the man writing it. Something shifted behind Crane's eyes. Just briefly. Then the smile came back. I don't make the laws. I just operate within them. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small card, holding it out between two fingers. If you're considering staying in Dusthaven for any length of time, come see me. I have interests that could use a capable man. You look capable. Ethan looked at the card without taking it. I appreciate that. Crane held it a moment longer, then retracted it smoothly. Offer stands. He turned back toward his building, then paused as if something had just occurred to him. A word of friendly advice, Calloway. People in this town have learned that the Holt situation is more complicated than it appears. The ones who involved themselves early on found it wasn't worth the trouble. He said it pleasantly, conversationally, the way a man mentions the weather. Just something to consider. He walked back to his boardwalk and went inside without looking back. Ethan stood in the street for a moment. He turned the exchange over in his mind, the way you turn a coin over when you want to be sure of what you're holding. Then he walked to the livery, paid for Scout's stall and feed, and went back to the Holt building. Danny opened the door before he knocked. The boy had heard his boots on the step. "The doctor," he asked, "coming in an hour." Clara appeared behind Danny's shoulder. He agreed. He did. Something crossed Clara's face, relief, and then immediately the complicated thing that comes after relief when you've been disappointed before and aren't sure you can trust the feeling. She turned back inside without saying anything. Ethan came in and set his hat on a broken chair near the door. He looked at Maggie Holt. She hadn't moved. Her breathing was the same shallow rhythm it had been before, but her color was worse in the fading light, the flush deeper, the skin around her mouth gone pale in a way that worried him. "She made a sound a little while ago," Tommy said from the corner, "like she was trying to say something, but it wasn't words." "That happens with fever," Ethan said. "It's all right." Tommy nodded, wanting to believe that. Bea had fallen asleep, curled at the foot of the cot, her hand still loosely touching her mother's ankle. Ada was sitting with her back against the wall near the window, looking at Ethan with that measuring quiet of hers. Danny stood with his arms crossed, not hostile, just watchful. Clara was wringing out the cloth in the bucket and laying it again on Maggie's forehead with a careful, practiced movement that made it clear she had done it 1,000 times. "You spoke to Crane," Danny said. It wasn't a question. Ethan looked at him. "He came to me." The boy's jaw worked. "What did he say?" "That he has sympathy for your family, that a debt is a debt." "That's what he always says." Danny's voice had gone flat. "He said it to Mama too, when she went to him after Papa died. She went and asked him for more time. She brought him a pie she'd baked." His throat moved. He took the pie. He gave her 2 extra weeks. Clara laughed. It was a short, sharp sound, not much like laughter. "He ate it in front of her," she said. "His man told the general store owner, sat there, and ate the whole thing while she waited in the hall." The room was quiet, except for Maggie's breathing. "He came to warn you off," Danny said. "Didn't he?" Ethan didn't lie to him. "Yes." Danny looked at him. "Are you warned off?" Ethan pulled the broken chair from by the door and sat down on it. It held barely. "I had a conversation with a man once," he said. "Long time ago. He told me that the only thing worse than trouble finding you was watching trouble find someone else and deciding it wasn't your problem." He looked at the boy. "I've spent about 11 years testing whether he was right." "Was he?" "Yeah," Ethan said. "He was." Danny uncrossed his arms slowly. He sat down on the floor with his back against the cot close to his mother's side, not touching her, just close. The way people sit near things that matter when they're afraid of losing them. The hour passed. When the knock came, Danny tensed, but Ethan was already at the door. Rourke came in with his bag and 2 wrapped parcels under his arm. He didn't say anything to Ethan. He set the parcels down, crossed to the cot, and began his examination with the efficiency of a man who had decided to stop arguing with himself. He checked Maggie's pulse, her temperature, her breathing. He pressed carefully at her side and watched her face for a reaction. He checked her eyes. "How long since she drank water?" he asked. I gave her some this morning, Clara said. She swallowed a little. She needs to drink every hour. Wake her if you have to. He opened one of the parcels and began measuring out powder from a small jar. This goes in water. Not too much water, a quarter cup. You make sure she gets all of it, not just what she swallows easy. He looked up at Clara. You understand? Yes, Clara said. This one, he held up a second small bottle, is for the fever. 10 drops in water 3 times a day. Morning, midday, evening. Don't guess at the drops. Count them. He looked around the room. This building is too hot. Is there anywhere cooler she can be moved? No, Danny said. The windows need to be open at night. Both of them, even if it seems wrong to do with a sick person. The night air out here is cooler than this room, and that matters more right now than the dust. He stood. I'll come back tomorrow morning. Danny stared at him. You'll come back. Rourke picked up his bag. He didn't look at the boy when he answered. Tomorrow morning, he said again. He glanced at Ethan once briefly, then went to the door. He paused with his hand on the frame. She's still strong, he said, and it wasn't clear if he was saying it to the room or to himself. Stronger than she looks. That counts for something. He left. Danny stood in the middle of the room for a moment, not moving. Then he sat back down beside his mother's cot and put his face briefly in his hands. Not crying, just stopping for just a second, letting himself feel how tired he was. Clara mixed the medicine into water with the focused precision of a girl who had decided to do this exactly right. She sat on the edge of the cot and lifted her mother's head with a gentleness that didn't match her usually sharp manner. Mama, she said softly. Mama, you need to drink. Maggie didn't open her eyes, but her lips parted. Clara held the cup, patient, steady, waiting. A swallow, small, effortful. Good, Clara whispered. Good, Mama. Again. Another swallow. Bee had woken at the sound of her sister's voice and was watching from the foot of the cot, with her legs folded under her face very serious. Tommy sat beside Ada against the wall. For once he wasn't talking. Ada's hand was over his, and he'd let her take it without complaint. Ethan sat in the broken chair and watched the family arrange itself around the woman at its center. There was a specific kind of love in that room that he recognized and hadn't been close to in a very long time. Not the easy kind. The kind that had been pressure-tested. The kind that had learned to be practical about itself because it couldn't afford not to be and had stayed love anyway. After a while, when the medicine had been given and Bee had fallen asleep again, and Tommy had followed shortly after, Danny came and sat on the floor near Ethan's chair. He didn't say anything for a minute. Then quietly, "You used to be a lawman." Ethan looked at him. "The way you stood with Crane," Danny said. "The way you stood with the doctor, that's not a regular cowboy." "Range detective," Ethan said. "Used to be." "What happened?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. "I made a decision," he said. "That was the right decision, and it cost me everything I'd built. Sometimes that's how it goes." Danny thought about that. "Do you regret it? The decision or the cost?" "Either." "No," Ethan said. "Not the decision." He looked at Maggie Holt's still face. "The cost I'm still working out." Danny pulled his knees up and rested his arms on them. He looked at his mother. "She's going to want to know who you are," he said. "When she wakes up, she's going to want to know why a stranger helped us." "When she wakes up," Ethan said, "I'll tell her." "What'll you say?" Ethan leaned back in the chair until it creaked in warning. "I'll say I came in to buy jerky and a tin of coffee, and I saw 5 children in the dirt with 1 biscuit." He paused. "And I'll say any man who can ride on after seeing that probably isn't worth the horse he's riding." Danny almost smiled. It came and went fast. "She's stubborn," he said. "She won't like owing anybody anything. I know the type. She'll try to pay you back." "She can try." The boy looked at him sideways. It was the first time all day that he'd looked at Ethan without the watchful measuring in it. "You're staying," Danny said. Not a question this time. "Tonight," Ethan said. "We'll see about after." Danny nodded and looked back at his mother. Outside, the Texas dark had come down completely, and the air through the open windows was, as Rourke had promised, cooler than the room. Not cold, not comfortable, but cooler. Clara had fallen asleep in the chair beside the cot, her head tipped forward, her hand still near her mother's arm. Ada had stretched out on the floor beside Tommy and Bee, all three of them breathing the deep, even way of children who had burned through every reserve they had. Only Danny stayed awake, and Ethan. And somewhere down the main street of Dusthaven, behind the glass of a well-lit office with gold lettering on the window, a lamp burned late into the night. Victor Crane was not a man who went to bed early when something had his attention. And Ethan Calloway, he had decided, had his attention. Maggie Holt's breathing filled the room, shallow still but steady. Steadier maybe than an hour ago. Ethan told himself he wasn't imagining that. He chose to believe it. Because in the morning there would be more to face than one sick woman and one threatening man. And the Holt children needed someone who still believed that the right decision, even when it cost everything, was worth making. Even if they didn't know it yet. Even if he was still working out night by quiet night, whether he believed it himself. Ethan woke before dawn with his neck stiff from the chair and the sound of Bee crying softly somewhere in the dark. He was on his feet before he was fully awake, old instinct moving him. But it wasn't an emergency. Bee had woken disoriented the way small children do in unfamiliar places, and was sitting up in the middle of the floor, looking around with the particular bewildered grief of someone who has forgotten for a moment where they are, and then remembered. Clara was already beside her, pulling her close, murmuring something low and steady. "Shh," Clara said. "Shh, Bee. It's all right. Mama's right here." "I want Mama," Bee said, muffled against Clara's shoulder. "I know. She's sleeping. She needs to sleep. I want her to wake up." "She will," Clara said. "She will." Ethan stood in the dark and listened to Clara comfort her sister with the voice of someone who had been doing it so long it had become reflex. 11 years old, and she had already learned to set herself aside. He sat back down in the chair and looked at Maggie Holt. Something was different. He leaned forward, looked at her face more carefully. The flush was still there, but the quality of it had changed in some way he couldn't precisely name. The fever wasn't gone, but she had stopped looking like a person fighting a battle she was losing, and had started looking just slightly like a person fighting a battle that wasn't decided yet. Rourke had said she was stronger than she looked. Standing here now in the pre-dawn dark of a Texas summer, Ethan chose to take that as something more than courtesy. Danny was asleep against the wall, his chin dropped to his chest, his arms still crossed over his knees. The boy had made it until nearly 3 in the morning before his body had simply refused further negotiation. Ethan had watched it happen, the slow, stubborn losing battle against exhaustion, the head dipping and jerking back up twice, 3 times, before finally going still. Let him sleep, Ethan thought. There would be enough to carry today. He went to the bucket, found it nearly empty, and slipped outside to find the pump. The hour before dawn in a Texas summer was the only hour that told the truth about what the day would cost. The air was still and almost cool, the sky a deep blue-gray, and the town lay completely silent around him. Ethan worked the pump handle, filled the bucket, and stood a moment in the quiet. He was thinking about Victor Crane. Crane had moved too fast. That was the thing that had been sitting at the back of Ethan's mind all night. A man with genuine legal standing and all the time in the world doesn't come out to the street to have a friendly conversation with a stranger the same afternoon that stranger arrives. He waits. He lets the law work at its own pace, because the law is on his side, and patience is easy when you're winning. Crane hadn't waited. He'd come out within hours. That meant something. Either Crane was watching the Holts more closely than a landlord collecting a debt needed to, or there was something about the Holt situation that went beyond an unpaid note. Or both. Ethan picked up the bucket and went back inside. Rourke arrived at 7 as promised. He came in without knocking. Ethan had left the door unlatched and went straight to Maggie without preamble. He checked her pulse, her temperature, lifted her eyelids carefully and looked. He stood back. "It's down," he said. Danny, now awake, was on his feet instantly. "The fever. 2 degrees at least. Maybe more." Rourke opened his bag. "That's good. That's meaningful." He didn't frame it as a promise, but there was a different quality to his voice than the evening before. "She's going to need the medicine again this morning, and she needs to eat something today. Not much. Broth. Anything with substance in it." "We don't have broth," Clara said. "I'll get it," Ethan said. Clara looked at him. She had the expression she got when she was deciding whether to argue. She decided not to. Rourke was measuring drops into a cup when Maggie moved. Not much a shift of her head against the pillow, a slight turn of her hand. But Danny saw it and went to his knees beside the cot in one motion. "Mama," he said. His voice came out smaller than he intended. Maggie's eyes opened. They were unfocused at first, moving across the ceiling, across the wall, and then they found Danny's face, and something in them steadied. "Hey, baby," she said. Her voice was barely there, barely a voice at all, more like the shape of one. But it was her voice, present and recognizable, and it landed on the room like a change in weather. Bee made a sound Ethan had no word for and threw herself across the room. Clara caught her before she could launch onto the cot. "Gentle," Clara said sharply. "Gentle, Bee, gentle." Bee pressed against the side of the cot and took her mother's hand in both of hers and looked at her with an expression of such complete, uncomplicated relief that Ethan had to look somewhere else. "Mama," Tommy said from behind Danny, his voice carefully controlled in the way of boys who have decided they are too old to cry. "Mama, you're awake." "I'm awake," Maggie said. She blinked slowly. "How long?" "Don't talk too much," Rourke said, moving to the other side of the cot. "You've been very ill. You're going to feel weak." Maggie's eyes moved to Rourke, then around the room, taking inventory. They stopped on Ethan. He was standing by the door, out of the way, holding his hat in his hands. She looked at him for a moment, quiet, measuring, not afraid, just assessing, and he recognized the expression because he'd seen it on Danny's face and Clara's face, and now he understood where it came from. "Who are you?" she asked. "Ethan Calloway, ma'am." He kept his voice easy. "I came through yesterday. Your children are fine." She looked at him a moment longer. Then she looked at Danny. Danny gave her the smallest nod, the nod of someone vouching for a person without wanting to make a production of it. Maggie looked back at Ethan, and something in her face settled not into welcome, not yet, but into provisional acceptance. "Thank you," she said. And though it cost her considerable effort to say it clearly, she said it clearly. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Rourke got the medicine into her small sips, and she submitted to it with the patience of someone too tired to resist. She asked for water and drank more than Rourke expected, which made him press his mouth together in the way doctors do when something is better than predicted, and they don't want to jinx it. He stayed another hour, then packed his bag. At the door, he stopped and looked at Ethan with an expression that had moved well past whatever it had been the night before. "I'll come again this evening," he said. "Keep the medicine on schedule." Then he was gone. The morning moved. Danny and Tommy went out to find work at the livery the way they did every day. Ada settled cross-legged on the floor near her mother's cot and read aloud from a small book with a broken spine, her voice steady and quiet. Maggie listened with her eyes closed, and once the corner of her mouth moved just slightly at something Ada read. Ethan went to the cookhouse at the edge of town and paid for broth and a tin of biscuits and carried them back. Clara took them from him without ceremony and heated the broth over the small stove with the focus of someone who had been given a job and intended to do it exactly right. Bee sat beside Ethan on the step outside the door while he cleaned his boots. She had a stick and was drawing something in the dirt with intense concentration. "That a horse?" Ethan asked. "It's a house," Bee said. "Ah," He looked again. "It's a good house. It has a porch," she said, adding lines. "And a garden. Mama wants a garden." Ethan kept working on his boot. "She tell you that?" "She told Danny. I was listening." B drew a square attached to the side of the house. "She wants tomatoes. And something else. Something that starts with S." "Squash, maybe?" B looked up. "Yes. That." She added a circle inside the square apparently representing a plant. "Do you have a house?" "No," Ethan said. "Where do you sleep?" "Wherever I end up." B considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "That sounds lonely," she said finally. Ethan looked at the small figure bent over her drawing in the dirt. "It's not bad," he said. "It sounds lonely," she said again, in the tone of someone who has delivered a verdict and doesn't feel the need to argue about it. He didn't argue about it. He was about to go back inside when he saw the man coming down the street. Not Crane himself, one of the men who'd been standing with him on the boardwalk the day before. Tall, narrow-shouldered, with a leather folder under his arm, and the walk of someone who had been sent to do something unpleasant and had made his peace with that. Ethan stood up from the step. The man stopped when he saw him. He took in Ethan's height, the gun at his hip, the way he was standing. He made a quick calculation. "I've got papers for the Holt residence," the man said. He held the folder up slightly, establishing its official nature. "From Mr. Crane's office." "This is the Holt residence," Ethan said. "Then I need to deliver these to the occupant. The occupant is ill. She can't receive visitors." The man's jaw tightened. "These are legal documents, mister. They don't wait on illness." "Today they do," Ethan said. He said it the same way he'd said everything to Crane the day before. Not loud, not angry, just settled. The voice of someone who has decided on a thing. "Mr. Crane isn't going to be happy about this. Mr. Crane can come speak to me directly if he wants to discuss it." The man stood there a moment, deciding. Then he tucked the folder back under his arm and turned around and walked back down the street. B was watching from beside the door. "What did he want?" she asked. "Nothing that matters today," Ethan said. She looked down the street after the departing man, then back at Ethan. "He'll come back," she said. "Probably. You'll still be here." Ethan looked at her. 4 years old, and she asked the questions that mattered. "Yeah," he said. "I'll still be here." B nodded, satisfied, and went back to her drawing. The trouble came at midday. Not from Crane's man, from a different direction entirely, the way real trouble usually came. Danny and Tommy returned from the livery earlier than expected, and Danny's face when he came through the door said something had happened before a word was out of his mouth. "Mr. Hartley let us go," Danny said. Clara turned from the stove. "Let you go how?" "He said he didn't have work for us anymore." Danny pulled his hat off and held it in both hands. "He had work yesterday. He had work this morning when we got there. Then Crane's man came and talked to him for 10 minutes, and after that, he didn't have work." The room was quiet. "He was apologetic about it," Tommy said. "He sounded like he was trying to be fair. He said he was sorry. He looked sorry." "He just wasn't sorry enough to say no," Clara said. Tommy looked at his boots. "No, not that sorry." Ethan sat forward in the chair. He looked at Danny. "Is there anyone in this town who isn't under Crane's thumb in some way?" Danny thought about it for a genuine moment. "Mrs. Alderman," he said slowly. "She runs the boarding house on the east side. She owns her building outright. It was her parents' been paid off for 30 years. She doesn't owe Crane anything." He paused. "She brought food when Papa first died. She hasn't been back since, but she was kind." "Anyone else?" Danny shook his head slowly. Then he stopped. "The Reverend Marsh. He's not from here, originally came 2 years ago. Crane gave money to build the church, so I don't know. But he's been decent to us." Ethan stood. "All right." All right, what? Clara said. She had her mother's voice when she wanted it clear and direct and not interested in reassurance for its own sake. What does all right mean Danny can't get work? We have no money. Crane's going to send that man back, and we're 2.5 weeks from being put out. I know, Ethan said. So what does all right mean? He looked at her. He understood why she was pushing. She wasn't being difficult. She was being Clara, the one who needed to know the real answer, not the comforting one. It means I'm going to go talk to some people, he said. And it means today we know who we're dealing with more clearly than we did yesterday, and that's not nothing. It's not much either, she said. Clara, Danny said quietly. It's a fair point, Ethan said to Danny. He looked back at Clara. You're right, it's not much. But it's what we have, and I'd rather know the ground I'm standing on than not know it. Clara turned back to the stove. The set of her shoulders said she was not entirely satisfied with this answer. The fact that she went back to the stove instead of continuing to argue said she had decided to accept it for now. Maggie's voice came from the cot quiet, but clearer than it had been that morning. What happened? Danny went to her. Nothing you need to worry about right now, Mama. Daniel. She used his full name. Even at half strength, the effect of it was immediate. What happened? Danny glanced at Ethan. Ethan gave him nothing. This was the boy's call. Danny looked back at his mother. Crane's man came by this morning, and Crane leaned on Hartley to let us go. Maggie was quiet, her jaw set in the way Ethan had been watching it do in sleep for 12 hours, and seeing it now awake and deliberate was something else entirely. He's trying to isolate us, she said. Yes, ma'am, Ethan said. She looked at him. It was the first time she'd really looked at him since she'd woken. Not the fever-weakened glance of that morning, but genuinely looked the way she was clearly used to looking at things. Taking them in. Deciding about them. Sit down, Mr. Calloway, she said. He pulled the chair to the side of the cot. Sat. Tell me how you came to be in my children's lives, she said. From the beginning. And don't soften it. He told her. All of it, the biscuit, the bread, Danny's eyes, the Dr. Crane on the boardwalk, the night in the chair, the morning. He didn't soften it. She had asked him not to, and he had the sense she would know the difference. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Why? She said. The same question Ada had asked the night before, the real one underneath. Your children needed help, he said. People's children need help every day, she said. Men ride past. Yes, ma'am, they do. So why didn't you? Ethan looked at his hands for a moment. He thought about 11 years of riding past. He thought about Abilene and what he'd left there and what had followed him anyway. He thought about B.A. taking his hand without any preamble whatsoever, and about Danny eating the smallest piece last, and about Ada saying, "And it's summer," with that precise, unembellished accuracy. I'm still working that out, he said honestly. Something in Maggie Holt's face shifted. It was a small shift, the kind that happens in the muscles around the eyes, rather than in any obvious expression. You're going to stay, she said. Not quite a question. Long as you'll have me, he said. She looked at him a moment longer, then she looked at the ceiling. I don't accept charity, she said. I know, Danny warned me. The corner of her mouth moved. Did he? Said you'd try to pay me back. I will. I told him you'd try. She looked at him again, and this time the expression was clear enough to read. It wasn't warmth, not yet. But it was the beginning of something, the first cautious movement of two people deciding whether or not to trust, and both of them old enough to know what trusting costs. Mr. Calloway, she said. Ma'am. Crane doesn't let go of things, she said. Whatever you're thinking about doing, going to see this Mrs. Alderman, the Reverend, whoever else, he'll know about it before you get back. He has people everywhere in this town. eyes and ears on every corner. "I figured," Ethan said. "I'm not trying to discourage you," she said. "I'm telling you so you go in with clear eyes." "Yes, ma'am." She settled back against the pillow. The talking had tired her, but her color was better than this morning, and her eyes were still focused, still present. "Danny told you about the papers," she said. "End of August." "He did. That building is everything. If he puts us out of there, we have nothing. Nowhere to go. 5 children and nothing." She said it plainly, the way she'd asked him to say things, no softening. "That's the shape of it." "I understand the shape of it," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the Texas sun hammered the street, and somewhere down toward the Crane building, a door opened and closed. B had come back inside and was sitting near Ada, the two of them speaking in the small private language of sisters. "All right, Mr. Calloway," Maggie said. "Go do what you think needs doing." He stood, put his hat on. "And Ethan." It was the first time she'd used his given name. He turned. Her eyes were steady on his. "Be careful," she said. "Crane is not a man who simply sends papers." Ethan looked at her for a moment. At the jaw that held even when the rest of her was giving out. At the woman who had kept 5 children alive through 2 months of fever and a Texas summer, and a predator working the legal angles with patient precision. "Neither am I," he said quietly. He went out into the heat of Dust Haven and walked directly toward the boarding house on the east side of town, where a woman named Mrs. Alderman owned her building outright and didn't owe Victor Crane a single thing. And down at the other end of the street, behind gold-lettered glass, a man watched him go. Mrs. Alderman was a woman who had clearly decided somewhere around the age of 60 that she had earned the right to say exactly what she thought. She opened the boarding house door before Ethan reached it, which meant she'd been watching from the window, and she looked him over the way a person looks at a horse they're considering buying thoroughly and without apology. "You're the man staying with the Holt children," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Come in out of that sun before it kills you." The inside of the boarding house was cooler than anything Ethan had been in since arriving in Dust Haven. She had heavy curtains drawn against the afternoon heat, and a ceiling fan of some kind rigged to move air through the main room. She was a compact woman somewhere north of 65, with white hair pinned back, and the kind of face that had been pretty once, and was now something better interesting. She moved with the efficiency of someone who didn't waste motion. She poured him water without asking whether he wanted it, and set it on the table in front of him. "Sit," she said, and sat down across from him herself. "You went to see Rourke last night." "Word travels," Ethan said. "This is a small town, Mr. Calloway. Word doesn't travel. Word is simply already everywhere." She folded her hands on the table. "He went back this morning. I saw him. He looked different than he's looked in a while." "Different how?" "Like a man who remembered something he'd forgotten." She studied Ethan. "That was your doing." "I asked him to reconsider." "People have asked Rourke to reconsider things before. He doesn't usually listen." She tilted her head slightly. "What did you say to him?" "I reminded him what doctors were for." Mrs. Alderman was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in a way that contained an entire sentence. "Danny Holt tells me you were kind to them when their father died," Ethan said. "I brought food. Once." Something crossed her face that wasn't quite guilt, but was in its vicinity. "I intended to go back. Then Crane sent word, not directly, of course. He never does anything directly. He sent it through channels. The implication was that people who involved themselves with the Holt family could expect certain conversations about their own arrangements." She looked at Ethan steadily. "I own my building, but I have suppliers. I have vendors. Everything in a town like this runs through someone, and in Dust Haven, that someone is Victor Crane." "And you stopped going," Ethan said. "I stopped going," she said. She said it clean without flinching from it. "I am not proud of that. I have thought about it many times since. But I am also a 67-year-old woman alone, and this is the only life I have built, and I was afraid." She met his eyes. "There. That's the plain truth of it." Ethan didn't judge her for it. He had met enough people who'd been afraid of things that deserved fear to know that courage wasn't the same as absence of fear. It was just what some people managed to do anyway. "I'm not here to relitigate what's already passed," he said. "I'm here because those children need people in this town willing to stand up, and I need to know who that might be." Mrs. Alderman was quiet for a long moment. She looked at her folded hands. Then she looked up. "What exactly are you planning to do?" "Crane's legal claim on the Holtz building. I want to know if it's as solid as he's presenting it. I want to see the original note. I want to know if Thomas Holt signed anything that gave Crane the standing he's claiming, or if he's building on assumptions because he has enough power here that nobody's challenged him." She blinked. "You're a lawyer." "No, but I know what a fraudulent debt claim looks like, and I know what questions to ask." He paused. "I also know that a man who moves as fast as Crane moved on a widow 2 months after her husband dies on his work crew is usually moving fast because he needs to get somewhere before someone looks too closely at the ground." Mrs. Alderman sat very still. "You think Thomas's death wasn't an accident?" "I think a fence anchor that gives way on a well-maintained work crew and kills the one man who has a property note with the crew's owner is a very convenient accident," Ethan said. "I think that's worth a close look." The silence in the room was a different kind of silence than before. "If you go after Crane on that," she said carefully, "you are not talking about a property dispute. You are talking about something that could get you killed. I've been in worse positions." "Not in Dust Haven, you haven't." She leaned forward. "He has 2 men who aren't ranch hands and aren't office workers. They came with him from Dallas 4 years ago when he set up here. Nobody knows exactly what they do for him. But since they arrived, 2 men who crossed Crane publicly have had serious accidents of their own." She let that land. "Unproven, uninvestigated, because Crane owns the only man with a marshal's star within 40 miles. Ethan absorbed this. "The marshal's in his pocket. Marshal Greer has worked for Crane's interests as long as he's had that star." She stood up and went to a drawer in the sideboard and came back with a folded piece of paper. She set it on the table. "I've kept this for 6 months because I didn't know what else to do with it. Thomas Holt gave it to me 2 weeks before he died." Ethan unfolded it. It was a letter handwritten. Thomas Holt's hand by the look of it. Careful, deliberate lettering of a man who hadn't written much but took it seriously when he did. He read it. The letter was addressed to no one in particular, which meant it had been written to be found. It described a conversation Thomas had overheard between Crane and one of his Dallas men, a conversation about redirecting the survey lines on the north property to place the Holt family's building inside Crane's legal boundary land they'd been occupying for 12 years. That was showing value now that the railroad was coming through in the spring. Thomas had written it down, he said, because he was afraid of what might happen, and he wanted there to be a record somewhere that wasn't in his house where Crane's people could find it. Ethan set the letter down. He looked at Mrs. Alderman. "The railroad," he said. "Spring," she confirmed. "She's. The route comes through the east side of town. Crane has been buying and consolidating everything on that side for 2 years. The Holt building sits on a corner lot that whoever owns it stands to profit from considerably." She sat back down. Thomas figured it out. He was going to go to the county seat to challenge the survey. He died before he could. Ethan was quiet for a moment. In his chest, something that had started as instinct had become certainty. "Does anyone else know about this letter?" "No one. He came to me because I was the only person he trusted who wasn't somehow connected to Crane. He knew my building was free and clear. He figured Crane would have less leverage with me." She looked at the paper. "I should have done something with it. I've told myself every week since he died that I should do something, and every week I've been afraid." She looked at Ethan directly. "I'm still afraid. But I am also very tired of being afraid, Mr. Calloway. And I think if someone like you is willing to stand up in this town, the least I can do is stand beside you." Ethan folded the letter carefully and put it in his inside coat pocket. "I need two things from you. The first is this letter. The second is whatever you know about the county seat, who's there, whether there's a judge who isn't in Crane's pocket." "Judge Alderman," she said with a small dry smile at Ethan's expression. "My nephew, my brother's son. He has been a circuit judge out of San Antonio for 11 years, and he owes Crane nothing, being as he's never set foot in Dust Haven and doesn't intend to." She paused. "I haven't written to him because I had nothing concrete to send. The letter changes that." "Write to him today," Ethan said. "Tell him what you've told me. Send it with the first writer out. And in the meantime, I need to talk to Reverend Marsh." She walked him to the door. On the threshold, she stopped him with a hand briefly on his arm. "Mr. Calloway." He turned. Her face was composed, but not entirely steady. "Maggie Holt is a good woman. She worked herself half to death trying to hold that family together after Thomas died. Whatever you can do—" She stopped, started again. "Those children deserve better than what this town has given them." "Yes, ma'am," he said. "They do." He found Reverend Marsh at the church replacing a board on one of the pews, with the focused competence of a man who preferred to have his hands doing something. He was younger than Ethan expected, mid-40s, solidly built, with the tan of someone who spent time outdoors and the eyes of someone who spent time thinking. He looked up when Ethan came in and didn't appear surprised to see him. "Mr. Calloway," Marsh said, setting down his hammer. "I was wondering when you'd come. You know who I am." "By now everyone in Dust Haven knows who you are." The Reverend sat on the pew he'd been repairing and gestured to the one across from it. "Sit down. You look like a man who's been having a long couple of days." Ethan sat. He told Marsh what he'd told Mrs. Alderman. He told him about the letter. He watched the Reverend's face as he spoke, and what he saw there was not surprise, but rather the expression of a man who has suspected something for a long time and is watching confirmation arrive. "Thomas Holt came to see me the week before he died," Marsh said when Ethan finished. "He didn't tell me what he'd overheard, but he asked me to look after his family if something happened to him." He looked at the floor. "I told him nothing was going to happen to him, that he was worried for nothing." A pause. "I have thought about that conversation every Sunday since." "He knew," Ethan said. "He knew something was wrong. He didn't know how wrong." Marsh looked up. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to be willing to testify to what he said when he came to see you. I need you to stand in front of this town and say out loud what you know about Thomas Holt and what kind of man he was and why his death deserves a real look." Ethan leaned forward. "I need people in this town to stop being alone with what they know. Crane's power here runs on isolation. He keeps people separate and afraid, and as long as they're separate, he can push them over one at a time. The moment people start standing together, the arithmetic changes." Marsh was quiet. Outside the church window, the afternoon was burning down toward evening. Somewhere down the street a horse moved on the dry boards of the livery. The town made its small, ordinary sounds around them, sounds that had no idea what was being decided inside this building. "He'll come at me through the congregation," Marsh said. He said it thinking through it, not as a protest. "Half the people here depend on Crane's goodwill one way or another. If I stand against him publicly, he'll work on them. There are families who will stop coming to services." "Probably," Ethan said. "The church could lose support. We're already not well funded." "Yes." Marsh looked at him. "You're not going to tell me it'll be all right." "No," Ethan said. "I'm going to tell you it's the right thing. Those aren't always the same." The Reverend sat with that for a long moment. Then he picked up his hammer from the pew beside him and turned it over in his hands, slowly looking at it the way people look at things when they're really looking at something else. "Thomas Holt shook my hand when he came to see me," Marsh said. "He was calm. He was worried, But he was calm, and he shook my hand like a man who had decided to face whatever was coming. He had 5 children and a wife, and he was still calm. He set the hammer down. I've been a coward about his memory for 7 months. I don't want to be a coward about it anymore. Then don't be, Ethan said. When Ethan came back out onto the street, the light had shifted into the long gold of late afternoon. He stood a moment orienting. 2 people he'd needed had said yes. The letter was in his pocket. Mrs. Alderman was writing to her nephew tonight. What he had was a beginning. Not enough yet, but the shape of something that could become enough. He was moving back toward the Holt building when a figure stepped out of the gap between 2 storefronts directly into his path. Not Crane's man with papers. Crane himself. The easy smile was gone. What was underneath it was still controlled, still composed, but Ethan had spent 11 years reading men, and what he read now was a man who was recalculating. Mrs. Alderman had a visitor this afternoon, Crane said. She's a sociable woman, Ethan said. And Reverend Marsh. A pause. You've been busy, Calloway. Just getting to know the town. Crane took a step closer. His voice stayed conversational. Let me be honest with you, because I think you're a man who appreciates directness. What you're doing. This idea of building some kind of resistance around a family that has no legal standing and no resources, it's not going to work. This town runs the way it runs, because I've built it carefully over 4 years. One drifting cowboy with good intentions doesn't change the structure. Maybe not, Ethan said. Definitely not. Crane's eyes were steady. But it could cost you a great deal for very little return. I made you an offer yesterday. It still stands. You're clearly capable, and you're clearly not afraid of difficulty. I can use a man like that. Good wages. Real work. You'd be set up here in a way that a cowboy without a property and without a position never is. Ethan looked at him. He thought about Thomas Holt coming down from the North Ridge on the end of a snapping wire. He thought about 5 children in the dirt with 1 biscuit. He thought about a letter written by a man who knew he was in danger and still wrote it down so there would be a record. No, he said. Crane studied him. You're sure? I'm sure. The pleasant surface of Crane's expression had been thinning by degrees throughout this conversation, and now it was thin enough that what was beneath showed through clearly. Not rage. Something colder than rage. Then you've made a choice, Crane said. Seems like I have. Crane straightened his jacket. The papers I serve on that family will be legal and in order. When the time comes, there is nothing you'll be able to do about it. He said it without heat, the way a man states a fact about the weather. Time will tell, Ethan said. Crane looked at him one final moment, then walked past him without another word, and continued down the street. Ethan waited until Crane was well away, then let out a slow, controlled breath. His hand had moved to the grip of his gun twice during that conversation without him fully deciding to do it. He made himself aware of that, and made himself put it away. A gun was not the answer here. Not yet, and hopefully not at all. He walked back to the Holt building. Danny opened the door and read his face immediately. You talked to Crane, the boy said. He talked to me. Danny stepped back to let him in. The room was quieter than the morning. Ada and Bea were asleep against the far wall. Tommy was mending something with his tongue pressed between his teeth in concentration. Clara looked up from beside her mother's cot. Maggie was awake. More awake than earlier, more present. She was sitting up slightly against the wall, which was progress enough that Rourke would have approved. She watched Ethan cross the room and sit in the chair beside her. Tell me, she said. He told her about Mrs. Alderman, about the letter, about the railroad coming in spring, and what the Holt building's corner lot would be worth when it did. He watched Maggie's face as the shape of it became clear to her, the full shape, not just the debt and the threat, but the reason behind it, the reason her husband had died. She was quiet for a long time after he finished. Her hands were still in her lap, folded precisely the way Mrs. Alderman had folded hers, and Ethan thought about how women who had been through the same fire sometimes came to the same stillness at the center of it. "He killed Thomas," she said. Not a question. "I believe so. Yes." Her throat moved. Something passed across her face that was too large and too private to name, and then it went inward the way strong people take large things inward when they are not ready to set them down in front of others. When she looked at Ethan again, her eyes were clear. "What do we do?" she asked. He laid it out for her. Mrs. Alderman's letter to Judge Alderman, Marcia's testimony, the original note they needed to see the actual document Crane was operating from. There were legal avenues, county seat processes, a way to challenge the claim if they could get it in front of someone outside Crane's reach. It would take time. It would take the 3 weeks they had, and possibly more. "He'll move first," Maggie said. "When he sees it coming, he'll move before the month is out." "Likely," Ethan said. "And those 2 men of his," she said, "from Dallas." "I know about them." She looked at him steadily. "I won't have you getting killed over a building." "I'll do my best," he said. "Ethan." It was the second time she'd used his name, and it landed differently than the first. Less formal. More direct. "I mean it. This..." She looked around the room at her sleeping children, at the bare walls, at Clara sitting quietly listening to all of it. "This is my fight. My family. Not yours." He held her gaze. "I know that," he said. "But sometimes a fight is bigger than one person, and sometimes the right thing is to not be alone with it." He paused. "Your husband knew that. He didn't write that letter to himself. He gave it to someone else because he understood that a thing shared is harder to bury than a thing kept private." Maggie was quiet for a moment. In the corner, Bee stirred in her sleep and made a small sound and settled again. "He was a good man," Maggie said. Her voice was even. She had said it before many times to many people, and she had learned how to say it without breaking. But the evenness of it, the careful, practiced evenness, told Ethan what it cost her each time. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I believe he was." Clara stood up from her place beside the cot. She had been listening to all of it with that focused, calculating attention of hers. Now she looked at Ethan with an expression that had something new in it, not just assessment, but something closer to what the others had arrived at faster. She picked up the empty water cup from the shelf and held it out. "You should drink something," she said. "You've been out in that sun all afternoon." It was not an elaborate gesture. Clara was not the kind of person who made elaborate gestures, but from her it meant what it meant, and Ethan took the cup. Outside, the evening light had gone deep orange over the Texas plains. The end of August was 2.5 weeks away. Judge Alderman was a letter and several days' ride from Dusthaven. Crane had 2 men from Dallas and a bought marshal and 4 years of careful control behind him. And in that narrow building on the edge of a dying town, a woman with a fighter's jaw was sitting up straighter than she had in 2 months. Her oldest son was watching Ethan Calloway with something in his face that had not been there yesterday morning. Her daughter had offered a cup of water. It was not enough. Not yet. But Victor Crane had looked at Ethan in the street this evening with the eyes of a man who was recalculating. And that Ethan Calloway knew from 11 years of reading men in difficult places was the beginning of everything. The letter went out on the first rider before dawn. Mrs. Alderman had written through the night, Ethan knew, because he'd seen her lamp burning when he'd stepped outside at 2 in the morning to check the street. She'd brought the sealed envelope to the Holt building herself at first light, handing it to Ethan with both hands, and the expression of someone who had set down something heavy and wasn't entirely sure yet how it felt to be without the weight of it. "My nephew is a thorough man," she said. "He'll come." "How long?" "A week. Maybe 8 days." She glanced toward the cot where Maggie was sleeping again more peacefully than before. "She looks better." "She is better." Mrs. Alderman nodded. She didn't leave right away. She stood in the doorway of that narrow building for a moment, looking at the children, Danny already up and quiet by the window, Clara heating water on the small stove, Bee asleep with her fist curled under her chin. Mrs. Alderman looked at all of it with the expression of a woman settling a debt with herself. "I'll send food this morning," she said. "Real food. Don't argue with me about it." "Nobody here is going to argue with you about food," Ethan said. For the first time since he'd met her, she smiled. It was a good smile. It had some history in it. The days that followed moved in two directions at once: forward, in the small, quiet ways that mattered inside the building, and tightening in the ways that mattered outside it. Maggie improved steadily. Rourke came morning and evening, and each time the report was incrementally better. Fever, lower breathing, clearer. Enough strength returning that by the fourth day, she was sitting up on her own, and by the fifth, she was asking Danny to bring her the family's papers from the tin box under the floorboard. She went through them at the cot with Clara beside her, both of them reading in the close, focused way of people who need to understand exactly what they're dealing with. "The original note Thomas signed," Maggie said, holding up one page. "This is our copy. Thomas was careful about keeping copies." She looked at Ethan. "The amount Crane's claiming we owe doesn't match this." Ethan took the page and read it. She was right. The figure Crane's man had cited in the papers, the amount that justified the eviction, was $40 higher than the note Thomas Holt had signed. Not an enormous sum in absolute terms. Enormous in terms of what it revealed about Victor Crane's methods. "He inflated the debt," Clara said flatly. "By $40, Danny said. He was reading over Ethan's shoulder. He just added it." "Because he owns the only copy anyone in this town was likely to check it against," Ethan said. "And he never expected anyone to compare." Maggie's jaw was doing the thing it did. "We have Thomas's copy." "Yes, ma'am, you do." Ethan set the page down carefully. "And that's fraud. That's not a property dispute anymore. That's fraud, and it goes on top of everything else." He took the copy to Reverend Marsh that afternoon. Marsh read it twice slowly, then set it on the table and pressed both hands flat on either side of it, as if anchoring it. "He falsified a legal document," Marsh said. "He did. In a town where he controls the marshal. Which is why we need the judge," Ethan said. "And why we need everything documented and witnessed before Crane figures out we've found it." Marsh looked up. "He already knows something is happening. I had a visitor yesterday evening, one of his men. Came to the church, said Crane wanted to offer a donation to the building fund. Said it was an act of community goodwill." He said the last three words the way you'd say something that had gone bad. "I told him the church would pray for Mr. Crane's generosity and leave it at that." "He's testing," Ethan said. "Trying to buy you back before this gets further." "He's too late," Marsh said quietly. He looked at the fraudulent document. "How do we use this?" "Carefully, and not yet. We hold it until the judge arrives, and then we put it in front of him, along with everything else all at once. Crane has to see it all at the same moment. If he gets wind of one piece at a time, he'll start moving to cover himself, and we'll lose the advantage." Marsh nodded. He folded his hands on the table. "And if the judge doesn't arrive before Crane moves on the family?" It was the question Ethan had been carrying for 3 days. He had thought about it from every angle and always arrived at the same place. "Then we make enough noise that it can't be ignored," he said. "Crane works in quiet. He's built everything on people being afraid and alone and silent. The moment this is public and loud and documented, the calculus changes." "Public means risk," Marsh said. "Everything means risk," Ethan said. "The question is which risk you can live with." The trouble came on the 9th day. Ethan had been watching for it, had known it was coming the way you know a storm is coming when the light goes a particular color and the air stops moving. Crane had been too quiet since their confrontation on the street. Too quiet was never a good sign in a man with resources. Danny came through the door at a run just after midday, out of breath, his face tight. "They're at the livery," he said. Ethan was up before the boy finished. "How many?" "Crane and both his men, and Marshal Greer." Danny pulled in a breath. "They've got papers, different papers. Greer's saying the building is a public hazard. They're saying we have to vacate today. Not end of August. Today. Maggie was on her feet before Ethan could say anything, which startled him, because she had been sitting on the edge of the cot, and 3 days ago she hadn't been able to sit without support. She was pale, and she was holding the wall, but she was on her feet, and her expression left no room for discussion. "Help me with my coat," she said to Clara. "Mama. My coat, Clara." Clara helped her without further argument. Ethan watched Maggie Holt put herself together with what she had, which was not much physically, but was considerable in every other sense, and understood why Thomas Holt had been calm in the Reverend's office. He'd had 11 years of watching this woman, and that would calm anybody. "You don't have to do this," Ethan said. "Let me go first." "It is my building and my family," she said. "I'll stand in my own doorway." He didn't argue. He went to the door and opened it, and Maggie came up beside him, and together they stepped out into the flat white heat of the Texas afternoon. Crane was there, both his Dallas men behind him slightly to each side, in the practiced way of men who knew how to position themselves. Marshal Greer to the left, a little separate, holding a folded paper, with the look of a man doing something he had decided not to think too hard about. A small group of townspeople had gathered at a distance, the way people gather when they sense something breaking open. Ethan saw Mrs. Alderman at the edge of the group, her hands clasped, her face set. Reverend Marsh was there too, which meant he'd seen them coming. Crane looked at Maggie. Something moved briefly across his face at the sight of her standing. She was not supposed to be standing, not supposed to be coherent, certainly not supposed to be on her own threshold in any condition to face him. He recovered quickly. He had a practiced face for difficulty. "Mrs. Holt," he said. His voice was measured, formally sympathetic. "I'm sorry it's come to this." "No, you're not," Maggie said. Her voice was not loud. It carried anyway. Greer stepped forward slightly. "Ma'am, this order declares the structure a public hazard based on structural deficiency. You're required to vacate." "Let me see it," Ethan said. Greer looked at him. "This isn't your business, mister." "Let him see it," Maggie said. Greer handed it over with the manner of a man who expects to get it back quickly. Ethan read it. He took his time. He was aware of Crane watching him read it, and of the Dallas men watching Crane, and of the townspeople watching all of it from the edge of the street. "This is signed by you," Ethan said to Greer. "A marshal has authority to enforce a legal order. He doesn't have authority to issue one. A structural hazard declaration requires a county assessor or a sitting judge." He held the paper out. "This isn't legal." Greer's jaw tightened. "Crane's office filed the call. Crane's office isn't a court," Ethan said. "This document isn't worth what it cost to write it." A murmur went through the watching crowd, not loud, but present. Crane stepped forward. The pleasant surface was completely gone now. "Calloway, this has gone far enough. You have interfered in a legal business matter from the day you arrived in this town, and I am telling you now as plainly as I know how that it ends here." "Does it?" Ethan said. "These people have no means, no standing, and no future in Dusthaven. What I'm offering them is time to leave with dignity instead of being carried out by law. That is more generous than the situation requires." "That's one way to describe fraud," Ethan said. The word landed on the street like something dropped from a height. Crane went very still. "The note Thomas Holt signed," Ethan continued. He raised his voice enough that the people at the edge of the street could hear it clearly. He wanted them to hear it clearly. "The number Crane's office has been citing as the outstanding debt is $40 higher than the number on the original note. We have Thomas Holt's copy. We have a witness to Thomas Holt's concerns in the weeks before his death." He looked at Marsh, who was standing straight and still at the edge of the crowd. "We have a letter on its way to a circuit judge in San Antonio that describes the railroad route coming through this spring and the value of this corner lot to whoever owns it when that route is confirmed." The crowd was very quiet now. Crane's voice when it came was controlled and absolutely flat. "You have nothing that will stand up. I have enough, Ethan said. And you know I have enough because otherwise you'd have waited until the end of August instead of sending a fraudulent hazard order in the middle of the day with an audience standing right there. One of the Dallas men moved, just slightly a shift of weight, a hand dropping toward his coat. Ethan's attention went there and stayed there. And something in how completely and immediately his attention went there made the man stop moving. Don't, Ethan said quietly. Just the one word. The man looked at Crane. Crane looked at the crowd. He was doing the arithmetic in real time. Ethan could see it. Too many witnesses. The letter already sent. A judge already in the chain of events. The fraudulent document now described out loud in front of 20 people. The arithmetic was turning against him, and he was a man who understood arithmetic. Maggie spoke. She had been standing still and quiet beside Ethan through all of it, and when she spoke, everyone on that street turned to look at her, and she let them look. My husband worked your land, she said to Crane. Her voice was even. She was holding the doorframe, but her voice was even. He worked it in good faith. He signed your note in good faith. He died on your property, and you came to me 6 weeks later with papers. She paused. I have been afraid of you for 7 months. I have been sick and alone and afraid, and my children have gone hungry, and I told myself there was nothing to be done because you own everything in this town, and there was no one to hear us. She stopped. Let it breathe. I was wrong. There are people here. There have always been people here. We just needed to stop being alone with it. She looked at the crowd. Not performing, not asking for anything. Just looking at the people she had lived beside for years and had never properly called on. Crane has made this town afraid, she said. He does it one person at a time so nobody sees the whole shape of it. I'm asking you to see the shape of it now. The silence on the street lasted long enough to mean something. Then Mrs. Alderman walked through it. She walked from the edge of the crowd past Crane and his men and the useless marshal, and she stood on the step beside Maggie Holt and faced outward. She didn't say a word. She just stood there. Marsh came next. He moved through the crowd with the calm of a man who has finally made peace with a decision he should have made months ago. He stood on the other side of Maggie. Then a man Ethan didn't know. A rancher by the look of him, older, weathered, with the expression of someone who had been keeping a thought to himself for a long time, stepped out of the crowd and stood near the step. Then a woman. Then 2 more men. Not all of them. Not even most of them. But enough. Enough that the street looked different than it had 60 seconds ago. Enough that the arithmetic Crane had been running came out differently. Crane looked at it. He was intelligent enough to know when a position had changed beneath him. He looked at Ethan last. This isn't over, he said. No, Ethan agreed. It'll be over when the judge gets here. Crane straightened his jacket. He turned. His Dallas men fell in behind him, and Greer followed, and they walked back down the street toward the gold-lettered building, and Crane did not look back, because men like Crane never looked back when they were retreating. The crowd held its position until they were gone. Then it broke into the soft, uncertain sound of people beginning to talk to each other in a different way than they had before. Mrs. Alderman put her arm around Maggie's shoulders. Maggie let her. Danny appeared in the doorway behind Ethan. He had been inside listening through the door the same way Ada listened, completely and quietly, missing nothing. That was enough, Danny asked. For today, Ethan said. What about when the judge gets here? When the judge gets here, we give him everything. The original note, the letter your father wrote, the Reverend's account, the fraudulent hazard order. He looked at the boy. And we let the law do what it's supposed to do when it isn't being bought. Danny was quiet for a moment. He looked down the street where Crane had disappeared. What if it isn't enough? He asked. What if even then it isn't enough? It was a fair question. The most honest question anyone had asked Ethan in the 9 days since he'd ridden into Dust Haven for jerky and a tin of coffee. He thought about it honestly. Then we keep going, he said. San Antonio if we have to. The state capital if it comes to that. We keep going, and we stay loud, and we stay documented, and we don't let it go quiet again. Because quiet is what he needs, and we're done being quiet. Danny looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded. Once. The same nod he'd given his mother that first morning when she'd woken up, the nod of someone vouching for a thing. Inside, Bea had appeared behind Danny's knees and was looking up at Ethan with large, interested eyes. "Did we win?" she asked. "Not yet," Ethan said. "But we're winning." He looked at her. 4 years old, and she always asked the right question. "Yeah, Bea," he said. "We're winning." She seemed satisfied with this and went back inside. Maggie was still standing on the step, Mrs. Alderman's arm around her. The crowd had mostly dispersed, people returning to their afternoons with something in their faces that hadn't been there an hour ago. Marsh was speaking quietly to the older rancher, who had been the first to step forward. The beginning of something, Ethan thought. Small, tentative, the way beginnings usually were. Maggie turned to look at him. She was exhausted. He could see it clearly, the cost of standing there and speaking those words in the sun, the cost of being upright and coherent when her body was still finding its way back to strength. But her eyes were clear, and there was something in her face that had been absent even from the strongest moments of the past 9 days. Not just resolve. Something quieter than resolve and more durable. "Thank you," she said. "You did that," he said. "I said words about documents. You did that." She almost smiled. "You said the words about documents so I could do that." Something like that. She looked at him for a moment. The afternoon light was long and gold behind her, the way Texas light got in the late summer when the heat was finally thinking about easing. "What happens now?" she asked. "After the judge? After all of it? What happens to you?" It was the question he hadn't let himself think about directly in 9 days. He'd been too busy to think it, and he realized, somewhat afraid to think it, because the answer that had been forming itself without his full permission was not the answer he'd given to any version of that question in 11 years. He looked at the building behind her, at the corner lot that a railroad coming in spring was about to make worth fighting for. He looked at Danny in the doorway, and at the faint sound of Bea's voice inside talking to Ada about something of evident importance. He looked at Maggie Holt. "I thought I might stay," he said. "If that's all right." She held his gaze for a long moment. Whatever she was thinking, she kept it close, the way she kept most things close. But the set of her jaw, which had been holding against the world for 7 months of grief and sickness and fear, shifted just slightly, just enough into something that wasn't holding against anything at all. "It's all right," she said. Judge Alderman arrived 11 days later with 2 deputies and a court recorder, and the thorough, unhurried manner of a man who had read his aunt's letter 4 times and arrived prepared to be unimpressed by Victor Crane. The hearing took 2 days. The fraudulent note was entered into evidence. Reverend Marsh gave his account. Mrs. Alderman testified about the letter Thomas Holt had given her. The railroad survey documents were subpoenaed from the county office, which confirmed the route and the corner lot's value to 3 decimal points of precision. On the second day of testimony, Crane's lawyer attempted to reframe the inflated debt figure as a clerical error. Judge Alderman looked at the original note, looked at the fraudulent note, looked at Crane's lawyer, and said in the measured tone of a man who had been on a bench for 11 years, and had heard most things, that clerical errors did not typically occur in the direction that benefited the party. Making the error in every single case, without exception. Crane left Dusthaven 4 days after the ruling, quietly in the early morning with his 2 Dallas men, and very little else. The Marshal's Star was returned to the county within the week. The building on the corner lot was confirmed as the Holt family's rightful property, the fraudulent debt discharged, and the original note satisfied through a settlement arrangement that Judge Alderman described as the legal minimum Crane owed for what he'd done, given that what he'd actually done couldn't be fully accounted for in a civil court. Thomas Holt's death remained officially unresolved. That was the one wound that didn't close cleanly. But the circuit court in San Antonio opened an inquiry, and the men from Crane's work crew, who had been afraid to speak, began one by one to speak. The truth of it moved slowly the way truth tends to when powerful people have worked to bury it. But it moved. It did not stop moving. By October, when the heat had finally broken, and the evenings were cool enough to sit outside the corner lot, had a new porch. Danny and Ethan had built it over 3 weekends, with Tommy contributing opinions on everything and following actual instructions on almost nothing, and B periodically arriving with cups of water of varying cleanliness. Clara had measured the lumber twice before letting either of them cut a single board, which had turned out to be the right call. Maggie had her garden started along the south side, which Ethan had helped her dig when she was still building her strength back, and would only allow him to do it if he let her make the decisions about what went where. He had let her make the decisions about what went where. There were tomatoes, and there was squash, both put in late in the season, both doing better than they had any right to do in Texas soil. On an evening in the middle of October, Ethan sat on the new porch with Maggie beside him, watching the last of the daylight go out of the sky in shades of orange and rose that only happened over flat land, with nothing to interrupt the horizon. Inside, the sounds of 5 children doing the complicated ordinary work of an evening. Ada reading Tommy, arguing with Danny about something minor and theoretical. B explaining a situation at length to no one in particular, came through the open door and settled around them on the porch, like something warm. Maggie had a cup of tea. She had been drinking tea in the evenings, ever since Rourke had said the fever was fully gone, as if she was rewarding herself for surviving with something small and specific. Ethan had come to associate the smell of it with the particular piece of this hour, this porch, this woman beside him. "B told me today that you promised her a horse," Maggie said. "I said we could look at horses. That's not a promise of a horse." "She's telling people you promised her a horse." "She has an optimistic interpretation of most conversations." Maggie's mouth moved. "She does," she agreed. She turned the cup in her hands slowly. "She also told Mrs. Alderman that you're going to be here forever." Ethan looked at the horizon. "B said that." "She did." "And what did Mrs. Alderman say?" "She said—" Maggie said, the corner of her mouth fully committing now, "that it was about time somebody sensible decided to stay." He looked at her then. At the jaw that had held through everything and was not holding against anything right now. At the face that had been fighting for so long, it was only now slowly in pieces, learning to stop. At the woman who had stood on her own doorstep and told a powerful man and a frightened town the plain truth about what fear had cost them all, with her hand on the doorframe and her voice perfectly steady. He had ridden into Dusthaven with no intention of staying. He had bought jerky and a tin of coffee, and he had seen 5 children in the dirt with 1 biscuit. And he had understood in some part of himself that had stayed quiet for 11 years that some things could not be ridden past, that some debts were not owed to specific people, but to the simple idea that a person who could help and chose not to had made a choice they would carry forever. That a man who had spent 11 years moving away from things had finally, on a Wednesday in July, in a broken town in Texas, run out of road to move away on. He looked at the sky. He looked at the porch he'd built with his own hands. He looked at the garden that had tomatoes and squash in the ground. "I'm staying," he said, not as an answer to anything she'd asked, just as a thing that was true and needed saying plainly the way true things did. Maggie looked at the last of the light going out of the sky. She didn't say anything for a moment. She didn't need to. Then she said, "Good," and drank her tea. And inside the house, B's voice rose briefly in an announcement of something important before subsiding again, and the evening settled around them both, like something that had always been waiting here, patient and quiet, for the right people to come home to it. Some things are decided in courtrooms, and some things are decided in county offices, and some things are decided on porches in the long October light. But the most important thing that happened in Dusthaven, Texas, in the summer and fall of 1878, was decided on a Wednesday in July by a man who crouched down in the dirt across from 5 hungry children, set a loaf of bread between them, and simply refused to walk away, because a person who sees what needs doing and does it anyway, not for reward and not for recognition, but because it is plainly and simply the right thing, is the only kind of person worth becoming. And Ethan Calloway had finally, at 39 years old, in a broken town that was learning to put itself back together, become exactly that.
It too. We've got like probably up to 8 more rows to do. Only because I'm curious and not to put any pressure on you, but were you able to use? Not yet. Not yet. I'm going to this week, Mofunk. This past week was hella stressful. So trying to do anything else beyond what I had done was not possible. Thank you for asking. It is on top of my list of things to do this week. Yeah, I know, right? I know, exactly. I only had the energy to really do a little bit of knitting, and that was about it. And at that point, I couldn't even do like complicated knitting. It wasn't even that complicated. It's just like doing the rest of my knitted shirt, for example. Pergola project fully completed, and it's that's amazing. Way to go. That's congrats on that. Getting your code checked in, downloading email addresses you might want. Oh yeah, I should do that as well, Cranston. No, that's a good idea. I could do that as well before I turn in. Hammer drill. Oh, I don't even know what a hammer drill is. That sounds cool. Whatever the heck that is. Yeah, exactly, Cranston. No, I agree. I agree. Hello, Gibby. How's it going? Welcome in. How's your night? Welcome in.